It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm David First, WNYC's Weekend Edition host, filling in for Brian today. Happy Friday, everybody. Coming up on today's show, we will tackle two local stories with two of my colleagues, WNYC and Gothamist reporters Liam Quigley and David Brand. Liam is going to talk about the future of the city's carriage horse industry, which is under fire after a teenage tourist fell out of a carriage and was killed last week. And the New York City Rent Guidelines Board approved a 2-year rent freeze on rent-stabilized apartments at their hearing last night. David Brand will talk about the results. And we'll wrap up today's show with a look at how fruit has gotten sweeter than ever. Have you noticed that? Grocery stores now sell sumo citrus and cotton candy grapes. Even some blueberries can be extra sweet. What does this mean for our palates? What does it mean for our health? That's all still ahead. But first, is the Democratic Party splitting apart? That's one of the questions ricocheting around Washington and New York this week, and it's coming from some Democrats themselves. After Tuesday's primary results in New York City, former DNC chair Jamie Harrison tweeted, quote, "If you hate the Democratic Party, then please don't run for our nomination. Don't use our resources. Don't rely on our volunteers. Don't use our infrastructure." Longtime Democratic Party establishment figure James Carville went on the Politics War Room podcast and said this.
I actually do think it's time for Democrats to talk the S word, schism. I really do. Everybody's always said, no, we're coalition, we're big tent. And there's just some that I can't be in the same tent with.
Yes, there's some stuff he can't be in the same tent with. And there were these words from New York Attorney General Letitia James, who was speaking on CNN about Mayor Mamdani and his influence on the Democratic primary. Quote, "Some of the candidates that he has supported are individuals who do not understand the politics of New York City, the cultural differences from district to district, who have not been part of the history and the struggle of some of these districts, and are relatively new to the body politic. All of us are a little frustrated with the Democratic Party, but you don't blow it up. That's what MAGA has done." So, on Tuesday night, 3 congressional candidates with Mayor Zohran Mamdani's backing won their competitive Democratic primaries. Brad Lander beat 2-term incumbent Dan Goldman in the 10th district. Darializa Avila Chevalier defeated 5-term Congressman Adriano Espaillat, chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, in the 13th. And Claire Valdez won in the 7th district seat held by the retiring Nydia Velázquez. All 3 are in safely blue territory, which means they are likely headed to Congress after the general election this fall. We'll talk about all of this now with Lisa Kashinsky, a national political reporter at POLITICO, covering the 2026 midterms and the run-up to the 2028 presidential race. Lisa, welcome to WNYC.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So you have a lot to cover here. So talk about what just happened in New York from the perspective of the Democratic Party. How is this being viewed in the city, in the state, and nationally?
In New York, it's certainly seismic. And I think from everything that you read off, kind of just now, all of these national figures weighing in, especially some who are maybe a little bit more on the moderate end of the Democratic spectrum, it's having some pretty intense ripple effects nationwide. I mean, New York is deep blue territory. It is, in some ways, it's a very clear bellwether for the Democratic Party, but it's also not necessarily representative of where Democrats are playing across the map in the races they need to win to actually flip control of Congress. Like, a lot of what's going to happen with Congress is going to be decided by very purple districts in places with very different just kind of socioeconomic and demographic makeups than New York. But New York City does very much capture kind of the mood of the Democratic base. And you've watched it now from Zohran Mamdani's win last year into what we saw on Tuesday. taking a very leftward march, and some of it is in the policies, some of it is in the style, where we're seeing across the Democratic Party writ large right now, whether it is someone who is very far left or someone who is a little bit more towards the center, voters are really kind of glomming on to this new type of fighter, this very kind of like relatable, more kind of down to earth, anti-establishment, anti-incumbent type of vibe. So it's partly a very kind of leftward hold taking over in New York politics right now, and it's partly just kind of the broader politics of the moment and kind of the broader mood of the Democratic Party, writ large across the country in this moment, that
Hmm.
people are looking for a different style and oftentimes a different generation of leadership.
And listeners, we'd like to hear from you during this discussion as well. What is your argument for or against the Democratic Party establishment in its current state? And if you voted on Tuesday in the New York primary, what drove your decision? Was it Israel? Was it affordability? Was it because you were looking for someone who would stand up to the Trump administration in your eyes? Was it the endorsement of Mayor Mamdani? We can also take some calls from Democrats outside New York in places like Maine. Are you voting for or against Graham Plattner in Maine? Does the energy that you're seeing in your district look like a party that is getting stronger or one that is being blown up? Give us a call. 212-433-9692. You can call or text. Again, that's 212-433-WNYC. Lisa, James Carville, we heard from him at the top just now. He said it's time for Democrats to talk about a schism, splitting up. How seriously is the party taking that kind of talk right now?
There are definitely two camps emerging after Tuesday's results. One is very much that camp, the James Carville camp of um, maybe it's time to have the split, or not necessarily to have a split, but like to really confront the fact that the left is ascendant in this party right now, both again in policy and in just kind of the style of candidates that they're running. So yes, there was a lot of talk about that on, after Tuesday and just trying to grapple with this. And this is something that more moderate members of the Democratic Party have long kind of looked at with some wariness of, they don't necessarily think that the far left can win elections. Progressives, kind of across the progressive spectrum are proving that a little bit wrong with these midterms across the country because you have seen some progressive candidates, though maybe not necessarily DSA-backed ones yet outside of New York, but you have seen progressives win in battleground districts.
Hmm.
So because of that, you're also seeing folks like Chuck Schumer, Senate Minority Leader, say these are all of a piece. Like you have the progressive energy in New York, you have more establishment energy, or I guess more moderate energy in other parts of the country. And combined, it's now the party's job to harness this from all of these different places to come together to win in November. And that's kind of a paraphrase of something that Chuck Schumer told reporters earlier this week on Capitol Hill. So it's funny to talk about kind of a schism within the Democratic Party from Carville's perspective, because there's also a schism in people talking about the future of the Democratic Party, not just itself in like the candidates, but just, in trying to parse the results of Tuesday night.
Well, Lisa, getting a lot of calls and texts right now. If you
Okay.
want to join this discussion, 212-433-9692. And I'll read one text right now. Everyone you cited at the beginning of the show today is old and pro-Israel. Talk to young people of all colors and backgrounds. The boomers are literally dying. It's a new Democratic Party. We don't want Kirsten Gillibrand palling around with Ted Cruz. We want to see people stand for something real, authentic, and we want to see change. Talking about Ted Cruz and Kirsten Gillibrand, the bet they made over the Knicks game, right? But talk about Israel. Carville specifically pointed to Israel as one of the issues that justifies a schism. How much is the divide about Israel?
It's definitely a divide about Israel. Like this traces back through what we saw in the 2024 election with, kind of the uncommitted movement that emerged during the primary, the pressure on the Biden administration to take a tougher stance on Israel and what was happening in Gaza. And ultimately, there are Democrats, some Democrats who have believed for the couple of years since that not taking a tougher stance on Israel and what was happening in Gaza cost the party the election, cost Kamala Harris ultimately the election. So there's been this kind of argument within the Democratic Party about what to do, how to approach Israel, and kind of its allies in the US. And I'm talking kind of specifically about the American Israel Public Affairs Committee here, the very powerful arm of the pro-Israel lobby here in DC. Um, there's just kind of been this grappling ever since over what to do about it. And what we saw on Tuesday and what we've seen in some primaries, not all, because there have been more Israel-friendly folks who have won in some primaries this year. But what we are seeing is this kind of emergence of, we'll say Israel critical, folks who are critical of the Israeli government, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, folks who are very clear and emphatic in calling what happened in Gaza a genocide, and in their words, and really kind of making that an issue on the campaign trail and pushing their rivals to do the same. We saw that in New York and, both the criticism of over the term genocide and, taking money or having any associations with AIPAC. We saw that in Pennsylvania's third district, Chris Rabb, where, he was very clear about calling the war in Gaza a genocide and kind of pushed his rivals for not doing the same. So we're seeing this play out across the country. It's very much an issue and very much something that has become a flashpoint, both in the races that have already happened and the races that are coming up, particularly Michigan Senate primary, which is like very important to Democrats' chances of flipping the Senate and Republicans' chances of holding it.
212-433-9692 to join this conversation here on the Brian Lehrer Show. And I really want to hear from Maxine in Brooklyn. Maxine, you have a sort of a reality check for us.
Yeah, the reality check is that I can't speak for the other or about the other candidates, but Brad Lander has been a fixture in the community for 30 years in various positions. And, it's not like he's a newcomer or somebody that nobody knew, or he's kind of like, stepping in to break up the Democratic Party. That's an absurd description of him. And it isn't just his position in Israel. I mean, I didn't vote for Dan Goldman before because I didn't think he represented the community that I was living in. And I think that that's what's going on, at least for him. So I think that people are creating a reason that is not necessarily what's going on. And I wouldn't have voted for Brad just because of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
That's absurd.
Maxine, thank you so much for joining the conversation. And Lisa, let's hear your thoughts on that. A lot of the headlines are Democrats are freaking out, right? Or is it more along the lines of what Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer says? Another piece that you wrote in Politico has a section where it says the Senate Minority Leader spoke to reporters at the Capitol on Wednesday, suggested he saw the progressive surge on his home turf not as a warning sign, but as part of the broader momentum Democrats are building toward November. He says, we're seeing tremendous energy from all different areas of our party. You're seeing centrist energy in Virginia, Iowa, and New Jersey, progressive energy in New York City. We're going to harness it all to win in November. So make sense of all of this for us.
Well, first to address the call-in, yes, there is much more at play here than Israel, than AIPAC. That is one flashpoint in races that sometimes do feature that heavily and sometimes don't at all. And a lot of voters are, making up their minds for things that, don't necessarily have to do with that. And there is kind of a big, just in general, a frustration with the establishment and kind of incumbents right now and leadership in Washington that folks just that those who are in power right now aren't doing enough to either stand up against Donald Trump or either to just represent and reflect the needs of their voters at this point. And that is in large part what we're seeing happening in these races overall. And I think to, kind of what you just read off from Minority Leader Schumer, I mean, this is what Democrats are grappling with. I mean, back to what we were talking about a couple minutes ago is this there are kind of two ways to look at it. One is the Democratic Party more divided than ever, or is the other one we're seeing enthusiasm across the Democratic Party, increased turnout in some races, a big, a vibe shift that folks are coming out supporting Democrats of all stripes after 2024 when some voters shifted to the right. So it's very much like Democrats are trying to debate themselves over how to interpret what happened on Tuesday and how to move forward from it.
I mean, this is what happens during primaries, right? There's a fight over what we're going to be. And then things, in theory, pull together during the general election. Let's take another call. Reed, calling from Brooklyn. Welcome to the Brian Lehrer Show.
Hi, yeah. So as I was telling the screener, I am really tired of being browbeaten by centrist Democrats and institutional donors. I voted for Kamala Harris. I told my friends to vote for Kamala Harris despite a lot of hang-ups and concerns about the Biden administration's stance in Gaza and how they enabled that to, in my opinion, a degree greater than what Trump is doing now, which is kind of what people were warning about. But I voted for Kamala Harris and told people to do the same. And I'm really tired because I was told vote blue no matter who. And now that it's progressives in New York City who are winning elections, and it's Graham Plattner in Maine who's very likely going to go to the Senate. Now we're being told, no, party's fracturing, we can't do this. But next election, I know we're going to hear from the centrists, progressives fall in line. It's really frustrating, really alienating, and I think that they should be following the voters. The party should follow the voters, not the voters following the party and the donors. Thank you.
Lisa?
I think this is exactly what we're seeing play out in both New York and across the country, where there is this frustration with the status quo, with kind of this old school style of leadership and the kind of fall in line messaging that yes, the Democratic Party, both parties really do this. I mean, you see Republicans fall in line constantly behind Donald Trump, even on, things where certain members may not agree with him. You see a lot of that. And the Democratic Party is kind of at this inflection point where a lot of voters don't want to do that right now. They didn't think that Schumer and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries were doing enough to stand up to Donald Trump when he came back into office. They're frustrated at kind of entrenched incumbency. There's a race out in Colorado where a Democratic Socialist is trying to unseat a 30-year incumbent. You've seen incumbents fall in New York. There's just a big frustration right now within the Democratic voter base for something different. And it's part incumbency, part generational change. And I think that's kind of reflected in what you just heard.
We have a text here, someone writing in to say we are not blowing up the party. We're dragging it into the 21st century. And we're showing the corrupt New York City Democratic machine that we, the people, don't want any more of their internal king-making. So let me ask you about this. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries brushed off some of these results, saying that a handful of primaries going one way or another is not going to reshape who House Democrats are. And yet, as the Washington Post reported yesterday, 13 centrist Democratic House members and candidates signed on to a pledge called the Promise to America. As the Post described it, it's aimed at pushing back against the party's tilt toward democratic socialism. That's the description from the Post. Hakeem Jeffries is not one of the 13 people who signed on to that pledge, and Mayor Mamdani did not endorse a challenge to Jeffries directly, even though Jeffries campaigned against his candidates. So with all of this context, do you have a thought about how Jeffries goes about his job as one of the leaders of the Democrats as he prepares to welcome colleagues to the left of him, assuming they win in the fall?
So, yes, there basically the squad, quote unquote squad, is growing. We've seen several new likely members, like again, folks in New York, Chris Rabb in Pennsylvania, in the Philadelphia, based congressional seat, one of them.
Hmm.
The squad is growing basically. And so Hakeem Jeffries is going to have to deal with this, as especially if Democrats do retake the House and they're back, in the majority. He has the gavel or is trying to get to the gavel. There are questions. Do, progressives try and put up a challenger to him, whether seriously or more for just leverage on certain policy issues? He will have to deal with that. There will be, potentially this schism, we're back to that word, between what some of this growing kind of left flank within the caucus wants versus, some of these centrists who do, run and work and live in these districts that flip back and forth from party to party in every election. New York examples um, like Tom Suozzi. I'm thinking about several Pennsylvania races where Democrats are trying to win back. I do a lot of coverage in Pennsylvania, so it's always on my mind, and I know it's relatively close. So,
Hmm.
yeah, it really is going to be something that Democrats are that Hakeem Jeffries is going to have to confront, whether it's outright dissension about him becoming speaker, or it's looking, progressives looking for leverage to push through certain policies because their ranks are growing versus the centrists who do have to go back to these very purple, sometimes red-leaning districts and try and win election. There's going to be a lot of tension within the caucus, member to member, and Hakeem Jeffries is the one who's going to have to manage all of that, regardless of whether Democrats stay in the minority or take the majority.
And let's take another one of your calls here on the Brian Lehrer Show. We're speaking with Politico's Lisa Kashinsky. And if you want to join the conversation, 212-433-9692. Let's hear from Rocky in Brooklyn. Welcome.
Taking my call. I think what everyone is just disgusted with in terms of the Democrats, the leadership just seems fossilized and entombed in, politics that worked decades ago. And we're confronting MAGA. They're quite ferocious. They have a message. The Republicans always beat us on messaging. And somehow the good things that we do get buried under all the noise. And I don't think Leader Jeffries or Leader Schumer are the wartime Democratic leaders we need right now. They're just not passionate enough, and that's what we're seeing. It's business as usual with them. And I want to make one observation. I think that the way the country is going, today's Democrats are more like, I would say, a milder version of the Republican centrist Republicans, and Republicans themselves have gone so far right, they're falling off the page. Thank you very much.
Lisa, do you want to respond to that?
I mean, I know we were just talking about Hakeem Jeffries, but I do want to pivot a little bit to Schumer because Hakeem Jeffries has a lot of support to be the next leader. I guess to be speaker, should Democrats retake the House. Chuck Schumer has kind of been more along the lines of this, has kind of been facing this furor from the Democratic base, because the Senate is in a different position than the House on some of these funding fights. There is not much, that have really angered voters. Like, there's not much that House Democrats can do from the minority, but Senate Democrats, because of the filibuster, have more leverage. And this is what really riled people up about Chuck Schumer last year, was when he sided with Republicans to avert the first government shutdown. And he, held the line on subsequent ones, has really gone to battle over DHS funding, and stuff like that. But that anger really took off and has really left him in a precarious position. There has been no serious threat to his leadership within the caucus. There's anger and angst and frustration, but like no person has concretely emerged to be like, I'm going to challenge you or I should take your place. And those conversations kind of like, come in waves and then kind of like die out for a little bit and come back. But I think what we're going to see as we get closer to the fall election, and kind of through it, is there will be growing pressure on Chuck Schumer to maybe kind of step down, from his leadership post and then maybe not run again in 2028 because there is a lot of frustration with the way that he, in particular, because again, House Democrats have been able to kind of hold the line because they are in a little bit different of a position just by the different makeup of how the chambers work. So the frustration and the focal point is, I think, actually going to be a little bit more on Chuck Schumer going forward, both on Capitol Hill with his leadership post and what he decides to do in 2028, and if, say, DSA forces attempt to challenge him if he does run again.
And Lisa, the way you put it in one of the many pieces that you wrote this week, by the way,
busy week.
I don't know that you slept much, but you put it this way: the hard left. The hard left's Empire State momentum is a 5-alarm fire for Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. So that's what you're talking about right now. We're going to continue this conversation here on the Brian Lehrer Show. We're speaking with Politico's Lisa Kashinsky, and we're going to continue the conversation after a quick break. Again, if you want to join the discussion, 212-433-9692. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm David First, in for Brian today. We're talking about the Democratic primary results in New York and progressive gains this cycle with Lisa Kashinsky, a national political reporter at Politico. And Lisa, we were just talking about a possible challenge for Chuck Schumer coming up. And you wrote this week that in New York, leftist candidates, albeit those without DSA backing, have tried and failed to run statewide. So what would it take for a Democratic socialist candidate to win statewide in New York?
It will definitely, and much credit to my colleague Nick Reisman for taking the helm on the story that you've been referencing. He's my colleague based in New York, though I am from the state. Look, he's right. It's a challenge. One that I think those on the left have, kind of openly acknowledged. But like I talked to Rebecca Katz, who, New York-based progressive strategist whose firm had worked with Mamdani. She's involved in Graham Plattner's campaign in Maine and others, and she knows New York politics quite well. And she was like, look, this the building blocks have been kind of building up for years. And now what we saw happen with, Mayor Mamdani's win in New York last year in New York City, and now what we saw on Tuesday in those primaries, it's just turbocharged. So it really is kind of a platform or a launching pad for kind of the leftmost flank of the party to kind of take these wins outside of this area and really get into the rest of the state. Like I have family from the Binghamton area, further upstate, which is pretty purple. So yes, that stuff doesn't necessarily translate. What's happening in New York City doesn't necessarily translate around the state, which is why it can be hard to run someone statewide, in New York or any state that has that type of, condition with a very urban, deep blue hub and then more purple suburban and rural areas that you would also have to contend with in a statewide bid. But momentum, can beget more momentum. And I think that that's what progressives are really hoping to kind of seize on as further building blocks to try and make a run statewide.
Lisa, I want to read a couple of texts to you back to back and get you to respond that kind of two sides here. One, someone writes in to say, we're not blowing up the party, but we're lighting a fire under their butts, pushing them to wake up and do their jobs. We need a strong, vibrant, and effective opposition party to the fascist, authoritarian Trump regime. And then another text asks a question. If most of the general elections are decided at this point by a few battleground states, shouldn't a general shift to the left alienate the middle of the road voters?
That last part is the encapsulation of everything that we've been talking about today, and what the Democratic Party, in terms of what the Democratic Party is struggling with right now, is there has long been a theory of the case that progressives and kind of progressive ideals and stuff like that can't win general elections. You saw it in a little bit with the last major Democratic presidential cycle, where ultimately Joe Biden emerged as the nominee out of that crowded field that had the Bernie Sanders, the Elizabeth Warrens, et cetera. This is something the Democratic Party has been grappling with for years. And it's something that progressives are turning on its head a little bit nationally this year in some of these primaries. Because yes, New York was deep blue territory, but you have seen progressives emerge in some of the biggest, like out of crowded, like contested primaries, and in some case over candidates that the DCCC, the House Democrats' main campaign arm, have backed, who are more centrist and who do kind of trend to that theory, that theory of the case. Like California 22, a Central Valley seat that is held by a Republican. The Democrats, is very, very high on Democrats' target list. Voters there picked a progressive, Randy Villegas, over someone who was backed by House Democrats' campaign arm, who was much more moderate. And that's who they're putting up against this Republican that they really want to unseat. The same thing happened in Maine's second district, another very critical swing district, where a longtime, more moderate incumbent is retiring. Democrats want to hold that seat. A progressive just got through on ranked choice voting. So you are seeing in some districts, like say a very competitive one in New Jersey, where a more kind of mainstream establishment-backed Democrat got through. You're seeing this split, and this is what Democrats are struggling with right now.
You're talking about Rebecca Bennett winning the primary
yes.
in New Jersey's 7th.
Exactly. So she was a more kind of mainstream establishment-backed candidate who did get through that primary, but it just kind of encapsulates that, yes, that does still hold true, kind of that old school, I hate to call it old school, but kind of the more traditional way of thinking within the Democratic Party that kind of more, again, mainstream, moderate, I'm kind of just like broad brush characterizing here, politics is the way to go in a battleground district. But you are seeing progressives buck that across the country in battlegrounds. And that is the thing that Democrats are really struggling with right now, where it has been split in so many of these races, to kind of figure out what the trend line is moving forward.
We still have time for a couple of your calls and comments. If you want to join, 212-433-9692. Let's hear from Alan in Brooklyn. Welcome.
Good morning. In all of this, there's so much more discussion of the perceived mandate, either on the right from the outsized power given by the Electoral College to mostly white, less educated states, or on the left to the power given by very low turnout primaries in party elections. And I think voters have a problem with proprioception. They don't realize that they're not talking about others when they talk about what's wrong with the leaders of the Democratic Party. They're talking about themselves, if they're among the 90% of people who generally don't show up for primaries, or the 60% who don't show up for general elections for governor or Congress. They should be looking at themselves. The media should be focusing their attention on themselves and say the fault here is not so much with the leaders who can't find the clout to serve you better, but with the people who are staying home and allowing terrible leadership like the current presidential administration to take control in the first place. And I think we need a lot more attention to voter participation. In part, it's the fault of people like long-term incumbents who tended to encourage the culture of low turnout so they could remain in office for many terms. But now it's coming back to harm them.
What about that, Lisa? What about the turnout?
It's always comes down to turnout as kind of the joke in politics. Look, turnout is a problem for both parties in midterm elections. It's really hard to keep up presidential levels of turnout, especially among, lower, as it's kind of called in political circles, like lower information voters, who kind of tune in last minute, don't necessarily vote outside of presidential years, that kind of stuff. Um, I will say Democrats are through the special elections that happened last year and into what we've seen in primaries so far this year, Democrats um, are excited about kind of the enthusiasm that they're seeing in turnout, especially after 2024. Kind of all the hand wringing after 2024. We went into these special elections in 25 and into 26, where you are seeing Democratic turnout. You were seeing Democratic over performances in these special elections. Democrats are taking that as all good signs, even though, yes, there is just historically, consistent problems with keeping voters engaged in midterms on both sides. And I will say in my conversations with Republicans, particularly in battleground states, there's a lot of worry about turnout right now because so much of the Republican coalition right now revolves around President Donald Trump, and he's not on the ballot. He won't be again. And there's a real struggle on the Republican side with how to keep those voters engaged, to keep his base engaged, the MAGA coalition engaged when he's not on the ballot. So right now, this is a part where even though turnout is far from perfect on both sides, Democrats are feeling a little bit better about it than Republicans right now.
And Lisa, I know you just about have to go because you have another 25 articles to write by the end of the day today. Let's try to take one last call. Jane in Port Washington, welcome.
Hi, thank you for taking the call. I would like to just say that I am a regular Democrat, not terribly left, not terribly right. And I'm wondering about the messaging. And the messaging I heard last night and the day before from Mr. Trump was that we're all communists. That's the key word that's going to be coming around. He did the same thing with the Obama birther thing for years, and he's going to start with that. Now, I think that the Dems have to get some kind of message that says, wait a minute, we're not socialists, but we are for equality, and things like that. We are for good, strong unions and other things. They seem to not have a message back at Mr. Trump, and that message has to be repeated the way he's going to repeat that we're all communists.
Thank you, Jane, for that comment. And on one hand, no matter who's running, that's going to be the language probably used by that individual to describe his opponent. But Lisa, what about the messaging?
Yeah, so we're going to see Republicans, especially after New York, like they've been trying this since, for years, really. Anytime that there is someone that they can paint as a socialist who wins and that they can use to tie to other people, Republicans have tried it to mixed results. I wrote an article, again, with my colleague Nick Reisman. We team up a lot after Mayor Mamdani won last year. That night, we wrote an article about he just became the face of, Republicans just made him the face of the Democratic Party for the midterms. They're going to tie every candidate across the country to him. Centrist Democrats are worried that they don't want to be affixed with the socialist label and that may not play well in, again, these more, purple districts or other districts with certain backgrounds and demographics. And yet that kind of fizzled. In part because Mayor Mamdani went to the White House, managed to strike up some sort of relationship with President Donald Trump. So the attack line kind of became a little bit less effective. The long and short of it is this will keep happening. They did it again after Tuesday. The president, said, well, America will never be a communist country. House Republicans campaign arm, put out things tying people to socialist policies and Mamdani and folks who won in New York. Jury's still out kind of on how effective it'll be. It's a playbook they run all the time. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Well, Lisa, a lot of great coverage from you and Nick this week. Thanks for joining us. I know you have to run, national political reporter at Politico. Thanks for joining us on The Brian Lehrer Show.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And coming up next, WNYC and Gothamist reporter Liam Quigley tells us about the renewed push to ban carriage horses in Central Park. Stay with us. It's The Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC.